Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Despite the Zoom fatigue that many of us are feeling, you won't be disappointed because our guest today is Tyler Cowen. This introduction is probably unnecessary, so well known he is, but I'll do it anyways. Tyler Cowen is professor of economics at the Mercatus Center of George Mason University in Northern Virginia. He's a co-founder of the Marginal Revolution blog on economics. He writes a column for Bloomberg. His popular ethnic dining guide for DC area spotlights local restaurants. He authored 15 books, often bestsellers. He's also the host of the Conversations with Tyler podcast, where he interviews interesting people like founder of Wikipedia and the former director of the CIA, just to give you two recent examples. Today's conversation with Tyler will work in the reverse mode. So he got an easy part. He will be answering questions. I will start with mine, and then in the last 15, 20 minutes, we will be taking questions from the audience. Please use chat to ask your questions. I have my colleague librarian, Deb Smith-Cohen, helping me today handling Zoom, and she'll be monitoring the chat. So thank you, Deb. And if you're ready, Tyler, we'll start. Let's talk about food. That's how I discovered Tyler Cowen, through your ethnic dining guide. So how did you come up with this idea? Most of the restaurants that you review are under the radar of Washington Post food critics. Is this your personal economic development project to help local ethnic restaurants, mainly run by immigrants?
I was living in Orange County, California, and this is before the internet as we know it. I wanted to collect information on my favorite restaurants. So I typed out notes, and then I Xeroxed it and handed it out to my colleagues. And this was super successful. So I moved to Northern Virginia in 1989. I figured I would do the same here. I started it then, and very early in the 90s, I started putting it on the internet. So it was a very early internet product. And then it evolved and became better as there was better blog software. But it's been in operation for over 30 years.
30 years, wow.
Yeah, so there's a lot of places on it. I think it's about 120 pages, single-spaced, if you just print it all out.
So how do you find these places? I know you're a big proponent of venturing into the physical world, away from phones and laptops, but are you driving around looking for new signs?
Partly I just drive around and look for new signs, or I drive around for other reasons and I see new signs. But the best way to find places is people email me and tell me about them. I sometimes say my business model is reading my email. So if you write a blog on something, people will tell you all kinds of things, and that works. I mean, they know more than you do. And you can tell so often from the emails themselves how good the advice is. If the email sounds really smart, I mean, it's going to be a good place. I've hardly ever been misled by readers.
So please name 3 of your recent favorites.
Well, with pandemic times, I haven't been doing much recent dining out. I am now vaccinated twice, which is great. There's a new place in Fairfax called Yu's Garden, Y-U''S, and it's Sichuan food, but it's Sichuan food from the city of Chongqing and not from the city of Chengdu. And most Sichuan food you get is from Chengdu. So Yu's Garden is the best new place. It's super cheap. It's very friendly. It's not that spacious. I would say if you're not vaccinated, don't go, but it is a real gem. For outdoor dining, one of my favorites has been Alborz, the Persian place in Vienna, which I liked all along, but their outdoor dining is spacious and you're protected from the rain. You don't need to be vaccinated. So that would be another recommendation I have. That's an older place, but it's become much better lately.
Thank you. So how and when did you become such an adventurous eater?
You know, when I grew up, I was like the least adventurous eater that people knew of. Like I wouldn't even eat pizza. Pizza to me was weird and disgusting. I liked hamburgers, I liked veal parmesan, I liked fish and chips. But in my early 20s, I lived for a while in Germany, and everything I had eaten was gone. And German food, some of it was excellent, but you couldn't just eat German food every meal. So I just started trying everything. And then I was in Europe, so I drive around fantastic options of all kinds, including ethnic food, like Korean food in Germany, even in the 1980s was great. So that's really when it all started, was living abroad and being forced out of my habits.
Let's talk about curiosity. Some people are curious and some are not. Is it nature or nurture, in your opinion? And did curiosity run in your family?
It's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of traits, when you study them, they turn out to be 40 to 60% nature rather than nurture. I've never seen a study of curiosity. My intuition is that it is more nature than nurture. But in this regard, I am maybe the outlier in my family. My mother was very open as a personality type. Maybe I got that from her. But it's not as if my other family members are just like me in this way. I would say more not. So it's hard to tell.
Let's move to economics. What's going on with the stock market? Looks like it's going nuts. It kept growing during the second wave of the pandemic. Now retail investors add to the picture. They're playing pump and dump game quite legally.
Well, first I would say this, if anyone pretends to you that they can explain the stock market, you should run very rapidly in the opposite direction, because I don't think anyone can. And that's true for myself, it's true for professional economists, probably even for professional investors. But I would make a few basic points. First, I don't think that a pandemic should hurt the stock market that much. So a lot of companies had subpar earnings for a year, and now they're bouncing back. And furthermore, the companies that were hit the hardest were really small business, not what's in the Dow or the S&P 500. And a lot of the tech companies have done just great. Look at Amazon. Look at how much you've been ordering from Amazon if you're like me. So I don't think we should have expected a very large permanent decline, and indeed we didn't see one. Some people say right now stock prices are crazy high, but if you take something simple like the price-earnings ratio, it's slightly above historic averages for the last few decades. It's not radically above where it had been. So I don't know if it's too high or too low. I don't trade actively. Again, I'm not going to pretend I can explain the stock market to you or to anyone, but at the moment, it just doesn't seem that weird to me. I don't know what will happen, but it's not like the big puzzle right now.
So you don't think that this game on retail investors they playing, there was a thing that Mafia did with the stock market, right? With the small
GameStop, yeah.
pump
I
and
mean,
dump,
that's
right?
weird. That's like people taking up a new hobby, which is like screwing over hedge funds and billionaires who've gone short. It's a very weird event, but it doesn't affect the market as a whole very much. I don't think it affects the economy. It's people trying to manipulate prices of a few relatively thinly traded shares. So for them, it's a fun game. You know, dunk on the billionaires. It's part of the deal, but I don't think it's a significant phenomenon at the macroeconomic level. It's just like another weird thing people do. It's like their new form of esports, and we're probably going to have more of it.
Thank you. So what are some misconceptions people have about libertarians?
I don't know. I mean, I feel 20, 25 years ago, libertarianism was a coherent thing. There was more or less a common set of beliefs. And I think now virtually all ideologies have fragmented, including left-wing, right-wing, Republican, whatever. So maybe the biggest misconception people have right now is to still think libertarianism is this single coherent thing. I find libertarians disagree with each other as much as with other people. You ask a question amongst libertarians, what's the best response to the pandemic? Like whatever you think it might be, libertarians have strong radical disagreements on this. So I don't know, I think in a world where the internet is important, everyone becomes weirder Everyone is more eclectic and puts together different points of view. And libertarian, a lot of people claim that mantle. I don't know. If people call me that, I don't deny it, but I don't insist that I am either, because to some people I'm not, because I'm not for zero government. So I don't know.
Let's talk about regulations. Many business people complain about heavy government regulations in the US, but many of these regulations appeared in response to follies committed by some big companies. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created in the wake of the catastrophic stock crash of 1929. Dodd-Frank was signed into law after some large banks and mortgage lenders ran amok and crashed in 2008. The EPA was created by a Republican president in 1970 as a reaction to mounting pollution by the domestic oil industry and other manufacturing in the 50s and 60s. As a libertarian economist, how would you address this argument? And what would be a better response to this deviant behavior by business?
Well, there's a lot of different arguments in there. If you take, say, the EPA, which among other things limits air pollution, I think that's passed a cost-benefit test by a considerable margin. It's a much better America that has much lower levels of air pollution. So I'm all for, say, the Clean Air Act and the follow-up legislation. That said, and here's the libertarian in me coming out, I do think America is far, far too regulated, often at the state and local level. Our worst regulations are often restrictions on new building. I think most sectors of our economy are overregulated. I would include finance. I would not include pollution or climate change. But if it were up to me, I would, I don't know, maybe get rid of 2/3 of the regulations we have at the federal level, clear them out, very little occupational licensing, an FDA devoted to speedy approval and low-cost testing. The world would look very different. I think we'd be much wealthier and have a lot more innovation, but not everyone agrees. But some regulations are very, very important. We should fight to keep them or even extend them. And the environment would be an example there.
Thank you. And if you had the year of the current or a future American president, what would your advice would be on several things? First, infrastructure.
Everyone means something different by infrastructure. What I don't want us to do is pass some huge bill spending trillions of dollars, and then the 2 senators from Idaho get their hands on it. And you know, we're putting in new highways in Idaho because they want their cut of the pie. If by infrastructure we mean improving, upgrading, making our power grid safer, forward-looking, easier broadband for Americans, I'm all for that. But too much of infrastructure is backward-looking. I don't want high-speed rail between like different third-tier cities in California. I'm afraid we're going to waste a huge sum of money. I'm pretty sure we are. So yes, I'm for infrastructure spending in general, but I'm probably going to be against a lot of what we seem to be on the verge of doing.
But there's no any high-speed trains in this country yet.
No, but the administration wants to spend a lot of money to have some. The one place where we should have them, which is DC to Boston corridor, where it would make great sense. That's impossible because you can't get the easements and the permissions. The rest of the country, people don't so much want, you know, a high-speed train from Houston to Dallas, believe it or not. Now, maybe LA to San Francisco would make sense, but that's again a case you can't get the permissions. So they're building what, like something like Fresno to Merced, or like 2 cities like no one wants to go to, much less one city to the other. So I think that's on the verge of being a huge waste. But there are 2 or 3 routes where I would favor doing it if that is what we were going to do.
So next, so advice on fighting economic inequality, big problem these days.
Well, the problem of inequality, you can look at a few different ways. From my point of view, we have a serious poverty problem, but we don't have an inequality problem. So there are many poor people in this country. I think we should do things to help them. I'll come back to that. But I'm not worried about the fact that Bill Gates has a lot more money than they do. He didn't earn it at their expense. If anything, what Bill Gates did or most other billionaires have helped poor people. So I think inequality is the wrong framing. In a world with globalized markets, the richest people are going to earn enormous sums of money, by selling to China, selling to India. There's nothing wrong with that. It lowers inequality at the global level. Another point I would make, if you look at the figures for the whole world, income inequality has been going down for decades, not up. People never mention this. They think of income inequality as only something that goes up. But if you're asking what would actually help income inequality in the United States or what would help poverty, I think we have too many single parent families. I think we have too many bad schools. And I think it costs way too much because of regulation to move into America's most productive cities, such as New York City, the Bay Area, and many other parts. I don't think by any means changing those areas would fix the problem of poverty, but that's the list of places where I would start.
And your advice on how to boost innovation?
Well, I think right now America is having a glorious time at innovation. A lot of you, I'm sure, have been vaccinated. Those vaccines are remarkably effective. We did them in about a year, which was unheard of at the time. We're making pretty good progress on solar and wind power. We're making great progress on batteries for electric vehicles. There's talk that nuclear fusion might finally work. A lot to do with transportation and space is in the works. You can see real progress. So that's come after a several decades drought of innovation. So I think that's all great. We just need to keep it up and continue executing. I would favor more government funding for science, absolutely. But at the end of the day, most of the real work will be done by the private sector and academia and scientists. I would take in many, many more high-skilled immigrants to boost innovation. I hope we do that. That's the single biggest thing we could do.
Speaking of innovation, you were one of the first who identified and lamented the slowdown of big-time innovation, life-changing innovations, right? Has anything happened since 2011 that might have changed your opinion?
I think from 1973 to about 2018, 2019, innovation in this country was actually pretty poor. The big breakthrough was the smartphone, mobile device. That, in my view, is a big deal. But other than that, so many things were the same, just a little better. Like cars basically were the same. You could go back and drive a car from 1973 without having to learn anything. A person from 1973 could drive a car today without having to learn anything. I live in a home built in 1960. It's fine. That's a microwave, big deal. Now there's something wrong with that, but I think we're finally exiting that era. Try driving a Tesla, if you're even driving it, right? That's a baffling experience, even to a person from 10 years ago, much less from 1973. But I think we have this long period of stagnation. It seems we're coming out of it. The vaccines are the most visible sign of that breakthrough, and that to me is just phenomenal, super exciting. I'm really very keen to be witnessing it every day.
Let's talk about future of jobs. The Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari thinks that the automation and artificial intelligence will create a global useless class, and the political and social history of the coming decades will revolve around the hopes and fears of this new class. What do you think of that?
I don't see any evidence for a global useless class. I mean, let's go back to right before the pandemic. It was not long ago. The two societies with the most robots were Japan and the United States. They both had full employment. So robots, automation, they change the kind of jobs you have. That does create transition problems. But if you have okay macro policy, if you let resources adjust, if your people are well educated, they're going to go back to work, typically for higher wages. So that problem, it doesn't worry me. I do think there's a problem that not enough Americans, especially older Americans, are good at working with software, working with mobile devices, working with Excel spreadsheets, whatever. Younger people are catching up with that, but there is a real transition problem. If, say, you're 57 years old and your old job went away and you've never done tech, you might not get the kind of job you want. That's a real problem. I'm not sure we're going to fix it, but it's not going to lead to some large class of useless people roaming the streets.
So do you think higher education prepares young people for getting, robot-proof jobs?
Well, it depends a lot on the person. You can't just show up for 4 years of college and say la-di-da and think you're taken care of. I'm not sure that's ever been the case, but it's certainly not the case now. The more progress we have, the innovation, that's a good thing, but it does mean the more you need to retrain yourself. So the fundamental skill is how good you are at learning new skills. And I don't think college quite prepares us for that, even really good schools. Many people do that just fine, but part of our economic problem for, say, middle class, lower middle class individuals is they have not been taught to retrain themselves, and they find that sometimes a slow and painful process. I don't think it's an easy thing to teach people. It's not a once and for all thing. It's not like teaching them the alphabet or a times table.
And it seems like you do a better job getting new skills, relearning than men do. What do you think?
You came from Russia to the United States. You had to retrain yourself for a whole new culture. My wife came from Soviet Union. She had been a linguist and a Russian professor. She retrained herself to be a lawyer. Every immigrant to this country, even if they nominally have the same job, what they actually do, they are engaged in massive retraining, often in a language, not their home language. That's a big deal. Like we know it can be done. American immigration mostly is a success story. I think we need our native-born individuals here to be a bit more like our immigrants, would be one way to put it.
What's your opinion on universal basic income?
I don't think we're ever going to have it. I mean, you see from the pandemic, people want to work. They may not want to work every day. They may not want to go into the office every day, but they want those support networks. They want the socializing. They want to get out of the house. It's part of happiness. It's part of building a life. And the idea of paying people not to work, I don't think it makes sense. If you're going to give transfers to poorer people, to vulnerable children. That to me makes sense. To just hand out money universally, I think it's counterproductive. I'm against that idea.
And it's a huge amount of money. Andrew Young running for president made it, UBI, a thing that people started thinking about. And Finland did experiment. It costs enormous amount of money, right?
Sure, and we're doing this all on, with borrowed money. If people had to pay the taxes for it, this or next year, no one would favor the idea. There's this illusion that it's free because it's borrowed, but we'll have to pay those debts back. It's not a free lunch. It's a big conceptual mistake, in my opinion.
Let's see. Another question. How do you manage to do so much? What is your secret? Have you ever thought of writing a book on time management? Because time management books, many of them are so terrible, in my opinion.
I'm not sure all of my tactics would work for other people, but I can tell you a few things I do. I don't really watch much TV. My social life and my work life overlap very strongly. So most of my socializing, I'm talking about ideas with people, debating ideas. That's what I enjoy. I don't just ever go out and relax. I don't enjoy relaxing. I don't like to sit on the beach. I like to work. I like to get things done. I like to work every day. I get up at the same hour every morning, and I'm never really up and about after midnight or even 11:30. That's my life. I get that it's not for everyone, But I think if you structure your life that way, a lot of people would get more done. I don't know that they should, but those are just some of my basic habits, like a super steady regularity, sturdiness. I don't get sick very often. Just keep on going, do something every day, attitude, it will add up. I don't know if I can make that into a whole book, maybe like an article, because it's in a way too simple to be a book. And again, a lot of people don't want to do that. You tell people like, hey, here's this guy, and he says you should never relax. Like, is that going to sell copies of the book? I don't know. I think it might send people running in the other direction. But like that's, I think in a way I'm always relaxed. Like I'm pretty happy. I'm doing things I want. I have autonomy. In that sense, I feel I'm always relaxed. I'm not stressed. But I don't ever like sit and gaze up and daydream or no, I'm like, let's do something.
Let's talk about travel. Well, now we can only dream of it, but soon we'll be able to travel. You traveled, visited more than 70 countries, right?
More than 100 now. I think it's 100 now, give or take. I've lost track.
Right.
And yesterday I flew back from Miami. I was there for 2 weeks.
So what drives?
Might as well be another country. It was great.
And which country impressed you most?
Of the ones I've been to, well, the one that influenced me most was Germany, because I lived there, and then New Zealand, because I've lived there. The country I've been to the most is probably Mexico, which I just love for the food, the people, the art. I've been, I think, about 30 times to Mexico. Obviously, it's close. There's no jet lag. That's a big advantage. I speak Spanish. That's another big advantage. All countries to me are fascinating. I've never regretted a trip other than like super dangerous places. There's nowhere I don't want to go.
So that's how you discovered Mexican folk art, right?
Yes, my wife and I in our home, we have a very large collection of, you could call it Mexican Indigenous Art. It's from a group of people who basically are the descendants of the Aztecs. Spanish is not their first language. And they paint on bark paper. They paint just normal paintings with oil or acrylic. They do pottery. They're phenomenally talented. And we have a very large collection of their art in our house. In fact, it's the world's largest collection from that region. And I've made many, many buying trips there to bring it back.
Is it the same little village that you talked about in one of your books? What it's called, remind me, Oapan?
Yes, San Agustin Huapan it's called. And I've discussed that village in a few of my books. It's the same village. I know it very well. I wrote a whole book about the village. I wrote a biography of 3 artist brothers who lived there and their career histories. So that was a very rewarding book for me to do. Sadly, in the last 2 years, 2 of them have passed away. One of them just died of COVID in December. Very tragic. But that village has been a big part of my life. And my charitable activity, a lot of it has gone to sending cash to people in the village instead of like giving to nonprofits.
And you said in the book or in one of your talks, I don't remember, that being able to sell the art to foreign countries, to tourists first of all, and then to foreign countries, doing that online changed lives in the village, right?
Sure, most of their customers are overseas. There's a lot of prejudice against them in Mexico. People from North America often look past that and of course have more money. And a lot of them have gone from being like very poor on the edge of starvation to, I mean, they're not wealthy, but they're getting by and they have lives, and some of them have bought cars. Most of them now have televisions, cell phones. Again, I don't want to say that they're well off, but they're at a level they would not have imagined a generation ago.
Let's talk about books now. What are books that changed your worldview? You call them quake books, right? Not just you, but...
Sure. I think that phrase came from my colleague, Robin Hanson. Like early on, when I was a young teenager, I read a lot of Plato. And I got a sense of discourse and dialogue and philosophy and the ancient world. That had a big impact on me. That for me was a Quake book. As you might expect, I read a lot of economics like Hayek, Milton Friedman. Started seeing the world in very different terms, Henry Hazlitt. Those were Quake books. As you get older, it's harder to find Quake books. You learn particular things, you read more history, you read more biography, but some kind of revolutionary book where you say, I've just never thought of this before, at least for a while, that becomes a thing of the past. Now, maybe the world over time will generate more Quake books, but you're not 14 anymore. Like whatever new knowledge is coming out, you're learning it piecemeal as it goes along. And by the time the book comes out, you know a lot of it, or you've heard a lot of it before. So maybe, for older people, Quake books are gone.
Do you have time to read fiction?
Absolutely, I love fiction, and I often get fiction at the Fairfax County Public Library System, represented by you.
So glad to hear that. So what is a book of fiction that you think deserves a book prize but never received one? I'm sure there's several.
Well, I'm not always sure what has won book prizes, but here's sort of like the 5 or so great novels of recent times. First, Elena Ferrante, The Neapolitan Quartet. That one's very well known. I'm not sure what prizes it's won, but those are just phenomenal novels. I'd recommend them to everyone. Karl Kanosgard, the Norwegian author. I did a podcast with him, but the first 2 volumes of My Struggle, kind of autobiographical form of fiction, incredibly deep and thoughtful, highly recommended. French author, Michel Houellebecq, Submission. It's a kind of satirical Jonathan Swift-like story of a France where Muslims are taking over. Highly stimulating. Mostly it's making fun of France. Brilliant novel. It's very neglected here in the United States, not neglected in France. But here, a lot of people read Ferrante. Many fewer read Houellebecq. Then I would say Sebald from Germany, books like Rings of Saturn, Immigrants. They're sort of like deep memory books, highly impressionistic, very subjective, sort of probing into how people perceive events. And then maybe, Roberto Bolaño, the Chilean author who moved to Mexico. Savage Detectives, tale of like a literary club of poets. Phenomenal book. And the translation in English is as good as the book in Spanish, which is nice. Those to me would be like the 5 big things in the last however many years. Sebald like being by far the oldest of those. That's what I would recommend.
Thank you. So these are relatively well-known authors, right? What totally neglected author deserves better recognition, in your opinion?
Well, neglected by whom? Most people I know have not read all of those books. I'm not sure I know anyone who's read all of those books. I think science fiction is neglected, the great science fiction classics. But again, if you go to science fiction fans, they're incredibly well known. But science fiction is somehow this bifurcated thing. You either read a lot of it and go crazy, or you read none of it and you say, I don't get it. That to me doesn't make sense. Just think of it as another kind of fiction. Great classics like Boswell's Life of Johnson, one of my all-time favorite books. It's very, very famous. How many people have actually read it? I'm not sure. I mean, most people not. It's like 1,000 pages of a tale, biographical tale of talk over a dinner table. But it's just phenomenal, every page, I think. So like, I don't even know what's obscure anymore. It's become hard to say.
Thank you. And a couple more questions. So you love art, but libertarians must have hate NEA funding, for example. Are you torn?
I'm not really torn. So NEA is National Endowment for the Arts. The budget of the National Endowment for the Arts is very small. It's well under $200 million. A lot of that is spent on their own staff. And then a lot of it is sent to the states where it's spent on economic development projects. So if you ask, like, how much in a year does the NEA actually spend on art? It's well under $100 million. So that is the tiniest drop in the bucket. I don't think it really corrupts our arts. I don't think it really helps them very much. It's not a huge tax burden. It's just this tiny, tiny corner of the government. If it weren't here, I wouldn't shed tears, but I'm not like walking around pissed off at it. You know, it does what it does. It's not a major source of budgetary problems. It's not that effective. It's pretty bureaucratic. It supported some good things. It's wasted some money. It's like another donor. So not a big deal, I would say.
And speaking of books, which of your books is your favorite? And which one made you most money?
My favorite of my books is always my next book. And that will also be the one that makes me the most money.
And what is it?
It's a book on human talent. What do the social sciences know about human talent? There's no good book on this, believe it or not. And I co-authored this book with a very good friend of mine, Daniel Gross, the venture capitalist, who's a brilliant guy in his late 20s. And he spends his lifetime looking for talent. He and I work together. This book will be out in October. And you can find it on Amazon if you type in my name, Tyler Cowen Talent. You can pre-order it. That's my favorite book. But you know, after that, it'll still be the next one.
And you pledged donate royalties from one of your recent books. I don't remember which one, 2018, I think, to a man you met in Ethiopia.
You're correct.
It sounds like an interesting story. Could you tell us more about this?
I've been to Ethiopia twice. It's one of my favorite countries. It's also a very safe country to visit if you stay in the right parts, which is not hard to do. But I spent about 2 weeks there, and I went to the town of Lalibela, which is where the famous Christian churches are. It's one of the most fantastic sites of all of Africa. And I had a guide whom I call Jonas to maintain his anonymity. And he and I got along very well. I thought he was highly responsible. So a book I put out in 2018, I pledged that all of the royalties would go to him, which they have. And that has really transformed his life. It is not my very best-selling book, but for him, it's a lot of money. Partly I keep his name anonymous so his neighbors are not just knocking on his door all the time. And I'm very glad I did that. I think we should all, you know, look for ways to creatively give something back to people who need it.
Thank you. That's all my questions. Who knows, who's familiar with your podcast, Conversation with Tyler? Now you like to play this overrated, underrated game. I'm wondering if you could play a little bit.
Happy to.
Great, thank you. So overrated, underrated, artificial intelligence.
I don't think artificial intelligence is really a thing. It's a blanket term used by journalists to talk about a bunch of things they don't quite understand. In that sense, I think it's overrated. But look, if you consider actual progress in the area, like computers can just crush humans at chess, and we weren't sure 30 years ago that would be possible. In that sense, it's underrated. But don't think of AI as like a single technology or a single thing. It's not. It's an umbrella term. Everyone uses it in different ways. Don't get carried away by the words.
Reggae music.
Reggae is right now underrated. So reggae, you know, ska, reggae, dancehall, dub music from say 1962 to the late 70s for reggae and running up through the 90s for dancehall is one of the great musical eras of human creation ever. Bob Marley is very popular. Most of wonderful reggae isn't known. I don't even think Marley is close to being the greatest creator. So I would say highly, highly underrated. It's been a real cultural miracle. People just know a little of it, or they like connect it with smoking pot or something. It's really creative, and a lot of electronica comes from dub music. Just fantastic, what like King Tubby or Lee Perry, what they did with recording studios. Super underrated.
Washington, D.C.
Well, Washington, D.C., I don't know. If it's the metropolitan area, I think it's still underrated. It's one of the 2 or 3 best places to live in the United States. But DC itself, I think with the pandemic and work from home and slowness to reopen, I'm not that bullish on it. So I think Virginia and Maryland underrated, DC a little bit overrated.
American exceptionalism.
Well, by Americans, it's overrated, and by non-Americans, it's typically underrated. I do think America as a country is in some fundamental sense different, in a lot of bad ways too. And I think it should be understood as such. It's like not just another country. And you see this both like in its greatness and in its mistakes. And Americans who tend to be insular, don't always travel that much, they're just not good at getting how other countries perceive us. But that said, there's a lot of anti-Americanism, including by people who've never been to the United States. And I think they're underrating like the secret sauce of this country because they haven't lived it. There's so much creativity here, and I don't see that ending anytime soon. And until you've been in the thick of it, you can't quite get how much further ahead it can be of many, or indeed all other places. Not in every area, not in reggae music, but my goodness, in a very large number of areas.
And a couple more. Overrated, underrated. Obamacare.
Oh, I think it's overrated by both its defenders and its enemies. So to its enemies, it's like you've socialized medicine, you've ruined the system. The actual reality is the system was tweaked, maybe in ways you do or do not like, but American healthcare mostly operates the way it did before. And then the people who advocated, it's like this was going to cover everyone, even that it was called Obamacare, like it cares for you, linked to Obama. But the actual reality is the coverage it achieved was much less than what people had expected or predicted. A lot of the coverage gains were from simple extensions of Medicaid, not from this new thing, Obamacare. So I would say people who love it, people who hate it, they both overrate it. I would call it a marginal tweak for better or worse.
I saw some from the audience suggested the topic, overrated, underrated, education.
Well, I mean, what's underrated is learning, right? Education's overrated, you have to say.
NASA.
What'd you say?
NASA.
NASA. It had its glory period, which we're all familiar with, like 1962 through the mid-70s. Then it became highly bureaucratic. But I think people know it hasn't been doing much. It's probably properly rated, maybe has some kind of future, but I guess I would put my money on India or China to do something interesting, say with the moon. And for US space exploration, I would bet on the private sector. SpaceX, Elon Musk, like fantastic stuff. It does indirectly rely on NASA, I get that. But NASA's glory days are over, I'll say properly rated.
All right, I think it's, thank you. I think it's time to start reading questions from the audience. Deb?
Okay, so the first question was for you to recap the 2 restaurants that you mentioned, because not everyone got the names of them. I think a couple of people were furiously Googling to bring them up and just didn't get them right, so.
Sure, let me see if I can put them in the chat. I'll send it to you, Deb, and you can put it in the general chat. One is Hughes Garden in Fairfax, and the other is Alborz in Vienna. In Alborz, get the barg kebab with cherry rice, and at Hughes Garden, get the spicy dishes, but it's all good.
Okay. All right.
And now there's Mama Chang. I mean, you all know Mama Chang if you live here. That's fantastic. It's maybe the best, but it's silly to recommend it. It's like everyone knows how good it is.
Okay. And You said something about most regulations were not worth, federal regulations were not worth it, but what are important for society?
Well, I think the highest value area of regulation is the environment. Climate change, we should regulate much more than what we've been doing. I think in finance, the value of regulations imposing high capital requirements on all significant intermediaries, the value there is very high. Maybe those should be higher, a bit simpler perhaps, but I'm all for those and willing to consider making them higher. But that said, I think a significant percentage of the detailed regulations we have are counterproductive. You look at the FDA, the AstraZeneca vaccine clearly works. It's in use in over 15 nations with no problems, approved by dozens more. We still won't either approve it. We're now finally, it seems, letting the doses be sent to Mexico, to Canada. That's just the slowness and bureaucracy of the FDA. It's cost many thousands of lives. And there's not a huge public outcry about this. It's more visible just because there's a pandemic. But I think regulators every year are making major blunders of slowness and lack of prioritization. And we have a much poorer and less innovative world as a result. But I do think the good regulations are really important. Another area I would regulate more.
Actually, can we move on because we have a lot more to go?
Sure,
Is that all right to you? All right, sorry about that. Unfortunately, I'm just trying to include as many as possible. So what would you change about public libraries? And I might have been biased about wanting to hear the answer to this one.
I would drive the internet out of them. I know that's heresy. People show up, they just use the internet, nothing against that. Maybe there should be separate internet stations somewhere. But I think libraries should be for books, and you should deaccession fewer titles and make them exciting places to read where people bring their kids. Immigrants come to become Americans. And I'm like super old school on this.
Okay. And I have a long one to read. You've argued that maximizing sustainable economic growth is a moral imperative, assuming a zero social discount rate. But your caveat that with human rights as a binding constraint. Some would argue a livable wage is a human right. Others would argue free markets and life, liberty, pursuit of property are human rights. Where do you draw the line on human rights as merely a binding constraint? Is there a circular logic going here? Does this caveat allow us to dodge answering the question of what is a moral imperative? So, long one.
My notion of human rights is super minimalistic. You shouldn't just go around killing, torturing innocent people for fun. That's it. You can talk about living wage, but then you've got to ask, what do economies actually do to boost wages? And I would say they become capitalist. So talk of that as a right, it doesn't make sense. We want higher wages. That means capitalism. Let's go, full steam ahead with capitalism. So to me, human rights are pretty bare bones, not that complicated.
Okay. And what delighted you the most about America's response to the pandemic, including the developing of the vaccine, and what disappointed you the most?
Well, so many things disappointed me. A lot of people just behaved irresponsibly, or they wouldn't wear masks when they should have, or they engaged in activities that were higher risk than was appropriate, really on a pretty major scale. In those first 2 months when we knew it was coming, we were in complete denial. We said oh, this is a Chinese virus, it's not going to come here. That's the crazy bad side of American exceptionalism. It came here. We were totally unprepared and we had 2 months to get ready. So massive failures across the board. When you, look at the vaccines, how quickly it was done largely by immigrants, I might add, funded in advance by our government. That was a great policy, Operation Warp Speed. Really super strong record, like the best the world has ever seen. That will and should go down in history as like the moon landing. We all just lived through it. We're experiencing it now. That's one of the best things you're going to see your whole life. Hope you're all appreciating it. It is phenomenal.
So a question, suppose a poor country, X, is highly dependent on the export of a native crop like wheat, and it wants to enact free trade with other countries. Suppose a big, powerful, and wealthy country, Y, is very protectionist about its own wheat industry and wants to enact a trade deal that is free for most goods except wheat. What would you advise poor country X?
Well, they could sell equity shares in their wheat and limit their risk, right? That's what you typically do when you're non-diversified, is you sell parts of that risk to other people. So I would start there. But also, most economies can diversify more than they have.
Robert?
Oh, you're frozen, and I think we've lost
Yeah,
you.
we got some problems, but yeah, Tyler mentioned that if we lose connection, he will try. Here he is.
I'm here.
Good. We lost you for
sorry.
a second. Mhm.
Okay, so do you think insights from behavioral and economics and behavioral science are more broadly remain underutilized in terms of policy applications? And if so, what can be done about that?
That's a tough one. I think behavioral economics is mostly true, but in a sense, it's too true. There's like a different behavioral quirk for every situation. So when everything is context dependent, it's hard to offer general advice. So to use it effectively, you need to know a lot about the details of a situation. It's great when people do, but to figure out a question like people who are reluctant to take the vaccine, what do we need to do to get them to do it? We're just starting to figure that out. You can't just crack open a book on behavioral economics and find some recipe.
What is your advice for a bright young person entering high school now?
Get a smart peer group of like 3 to 4 people who are interested in broadly similar things and spend as much time with them as you can. And over time, get a mentor.
Okay. Have your views on neurodiversity changed in any significant way since you published Create Your Own Economy, The Age of the Infovore?
I don't think so. I mean, there's some books like after you write them, your thought really goes in a different direction. But in that case, I reread that book actually pretty recently, and I thought it still held up pretty well, or at least it's a good representation still of what I think.
Okay. The US's debt to GDP ratio is getting higher and higher, and the growth of entitlements will likely make it even higher. How will this affect the US economy in the long-term future?
Well, I think we're wasting a lot of money spending it the wrong ways. We should be investing more. But I don't think we're going to default on our debt. I don't think we're going to have a financial crisis. We're a very wealthy nation, and even a debt to GDP ratio of 200%. If you view that as a debt to wealth ratio, it seems like it would then be 30 to 40%. I think that's quite sustainable. So I worry about debt when we're spending the money unwisely, which is the case now, but I'm not like super paranoid about debt per se.
So you've argued that we undervalue the future, and so we should invest more in raising the rate of economic growth. This would mean making smart infrastructure investments, reducing FDA regulations, reducing the burden of professional licensure, and so forth. For someone of your aesthetic sensibilities, isn't that just too bland? Isn't the right path more opinionated and weird and less technocratic?
Well, I mean, weird. I don't know what's weird anymore. Like, am I weird or am I centrist? Or am I libertarian? I'm not even sure. So I would just say, look at the arguments, look at the evidence, try to do your best, see what you come up with, let other people decide how weird it is. I'm sure there's plenty of good recommendations, great ones that I've never thought of. You know, there's this massive division of labor and other people have their crack at it too.
Okay. What do you think needs to be done to reduce partisanship and help produce better policy discussions and policy making?
I think that problem is way overrated. Clearly, many stupid things are said in Washington. That's been true from day one. Mm-hmm. But if you look at over the pandemic, which nation in the world had the biggest fiscal response by far? By far. It's the United States, even per capita. Trump people did it, Biden people did it. So it's kind of like over time bipartisan. So a lot of the Biden policies, they're way closer to the Trump policies than they want to admit. The rhetoric is different. There's not the whatever stuff on Twitter. I don't think we're that polarized. I know that's an unpopular opinion. That's one of my weird opinions that I'm convinced of. We're not that polarized. We're just very weird.
So one person wants to argue you do relax but you just do it differently? What do you think?
I mean, it's semantics. If you want to say I'm always relaxed, like right now for me, this is fun. I'm relaxed. You think like I'm stressed? No, I'm not.
Okay,
But I'm never
so
like gazing at the stars.
this person says, I'm about to hire someone right out of college. What mistake am I most likely to make in selecting the best person?
I mean, that really depends on context. But here's one point I'll make. It may or may not apply to you. If you are a male, you will, on average, overestimate the difficulty of working with women who have difficult personalities. And you will not hire them as often as you should. And when it comes to assessing the intelligence of women, you will narrow the band that you observe. So the really smart women, you won't get how smart they are. And the women who are less smart, you'll think they're smarter than they are, because maybe on average, they'll act more pleasant to you. So when it comes to women, men hiring women, they get like the smarts wrong and they get the personality wrong.
So overrated, underrated praxeology.
I mean, rated by whom? Like the praxeologists overrate it. But look, it's true. Like man acts, demand curves slope downward. I think the economics profession has moved too far from praxeology and too much to naive empirics. So I guess I'll say underrated, but like its extreme partisans, still overrated.
Okay, and regarding your production function, how do you maintain a consistent routine, wake up time, etc., when you travel?
I adjust very quickly to jet lag. I don't have some secret. I just told myself one day I was going to adjust to it better, and I did. And I think if you're always working and like always curious, you'll carry this energy level with you and be pretty consistent. But again, some of that's nature, not nurture, and it's not universal advice for everyone.
Okay, and will there ever be another edition to the science of praxeology? Was it ever anything more than a guise for ideology?
I think economic theory is developing all the time. People don't always use the word praxeology, but there's just always new problems to think about. Like think about Bitcoin. Who was trying to analyze that, 15 years ago? So these are not closed sciences. A lot more advances are going to come, no matter what we call them, but they will be grounded in sound economic theory.
Okay, and speaking of climate change, what is your take on the carbon-free and dividend approach?
Well, I think we should have a carbon tax, but I'm increasingly convinced it's not the main thing. I think the main thing is being skillful and a bit lucky on the science. And we need new technologies and to learn better how to integrate them into our energy infrastructure. I'm now pretty optimistic. 10 years ago, I wasn't. I just see all these breakthroughs. I think we're going to lick it. It'll be a bit too little too late, but we'll muddle through, is my current view. It'll be bad and ugly. The biggest costs will fall on a lot of poor nations, not on us. But at the end of the day, in 80 years, I think we'll have a green energy infrastructure.
Okay, people are saying the smartphone and the internet makes people easily distracted and unable to do deep work. For example, Cal Newport advocated for digital minimalism and says that it's better to use a flip phone. What's your take on this topic, and how do you balance between information intake and your own thinking and writing?
To me, it's an overrated problem. I mean, I mentioned Bitcoin. Look at Satoshi, all that brilliant stuff. He or she had internet, right? Look at the mRNA vaccines. Look at all these kids reading these long Harry Potter tomes, which I don't like, by the way. But the point is, it requires some real concentration. Lord of the Rings is still popular. Shakespeare is still popular. Jane Austen maybe has never been more popular. So I don't think it's either or.
Okay. Recently, the Wall Street Journal had an article about hospital systems hiding their charges list, which they are required to post online now. What would be true medical transparency? Oh, what would true medical transparency bring to the consumer, and what would it actually change?
Well, that's an area where I would have more regulation for more price transparency. I don't think I know enough to know how much that would matter. I suspect a lot of the gains for cheaper healthcare will come through the medium of retail clinics, which are already fairly price transparent. And maybe we need to get some more things out of hospitals and also have more medical tourism, where again, the prices are pretty transparent.
Mm-hmm. Related to the debate of working from home and at the office, how important is the Medici effect, the claim that unplanned spontaneous interactions such as bumping into someone in the cafeteria will lead to innovation?
I think it's very important, but I think you don't need 5 days a week for that. So way more people are going to be in the office 1 or 2 days a week. Companies will have get-togethers, retreats, trips together. I think it'll be a much better world, and it will be easier to live where you want, easier to live near good childcare. It'll be a huge advance. We're just starting to see it happen.
Okay, here's one that I think is fun. Given your personality and approach to problems, what mistakes are you most likely to make in work, communication, or interpersonal relationships?
I don't know that I'm always good at cooperating with people. I think I'm good at delegating authority, like you do it. And I think I'm good at like, hey, I'll do it. But there's some kind of intermediate ground where it's neither of those. And it's just like a systematic failing. I don't think I'm always that good at that. I think I have a certain kind of impatience that makes me hard to work with. But fortunately, I'm pretty good at delegating.
Now, you've talked in the past about NIMBYism as being a huge problem, particularly in successful cities. How would you recommend this be overcome in the future, particularly from a libertarian perspective?
The people I know who know most about this tell me when building regulation is done by the states rather than cities and counties, that more gets built. And you do see this in Japan, where building regulation is done by higher political units. I'm not sure I have the firsthand knowledge to endorse that view, but that's what I have heard from many others.
Okay. So someone's asking, what is another thing or two not polarized that you believe that almost everyone else doesn't?
You mean a policy issue? I think Americans agree on most things, and they're pretty happy with America. And a lot of the debating is about symbolic values and cultural symbols, but like actually, what should the government budget look like? I think there's way more agreement than you might think if you just read like mainstream media.
You spoke with Glenn Weil, that may be Whale, I'm not sure, about about how to become more Hegelian. How does one settle on the right level of Hegelianism without overshooting?
I'm not sure you can overshoot, but I would say interact with a diverse set of individuals, let them influence you, and always try to be incorporating other ideas so your worldview gets larger and larger. That to me is what it means to be a Hegelian today. I think it's mostly a good thing.
Negative income tax proposals seem essentially the same to you as UBI or something different or better?
People use the words in so many different ways. I would just say if we're going to send around cash, let's focus on children. Have UBI for little kids, for babies. It will encourage births. A lot of children are in vulnerable positions. If there's poverty involved, like it's never the fault of the kid, right? So I would look in that direction.
Okay. What does the future of independent film industry look like to you?
Filmmaking has declined in value precipitously because of digitalization, and it's easier than ever before to be a foreign filmmaker who can do well in other countries. So that's just going to mean a lot more independent production, but that's already happened. I don't know how much more there is for that trend to run. The old studio system died a long time ago. The whole like Marvel franchise thing to me is deadly dull. Let them make money, that's fine. I'll go watch something else. But mostly we're already in that world.
Okay. Do you think the disruption from the pandemic will end up boosting productivity?
It already has. So just everyone on a Zoom call. So many talks I give are Zoom talks. If the pandemic were over for 2 years, we'd still be doing this on Zoom and it would be way more effective. And that is permanent forever. So work from home, talks on Zoom, why fly to South Korea, and so on and so on. All this business travel, a lot of it was BS to begin with. That's going to be a huge gain. We're seeing it already. get rid of it.
Okay. You once said on MR, Mises' best book was The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality. What was human action lacking that IT had?
Mises's best book. Human
Mises,
action to
sorry.
me is too large and sprawling, and I think Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State captured the important parts of human action in a far more intelligible form. So the value added of human action for me is just not very large. Anti-capitalist mentality is quite original, and it answers an important question, or addresses it.
School boards changing admissions at elite high schools from merit-based to lotteries, yes or no?
If you're asking about Thomas Jefferson, I suspect these changes will matter less than people think, but I'm against the changes. I'm for the older system. I think standardized tests are great. I think we should use them more, not less.
Okay. What would be your last meal? By preference.
You know, the best meal I ever had was in Tokyo. It was at the Tokyo branch of a French Michelin restaurant called Pierre Cagnier. Doesn't exist anymore. If I could bring that place back, or just like eat some phenomenal Mexican street food for $2 in northern Mexico, one of those two things.
Is there anything you're hoping we don't ask you about?
I don't know. You know, I do a lot of ask me anythings, and I haven't ever gotten a question like that. There might be things a person's told me in confidence where I just have to say, I can't talk about that. Maybe like, I hope you don't ask that. But my life, if you like read my stuff, it's remarkably transparent. Like, you know what I'm doing, like way more than you think you do. Maybe that's like great, maybe it's sad, some mix of the two. But like, you know what I'm reading, you know I'm reading, you know what I'm writing, like that's what I'm doing all day.
I'm going to keep going until Vlad tells me to stop because there are still a couple more. But
Well, we have to ask Tyler,
Okay.
because we asked for an hour.
How many more questions?
There are 5, but people have to stop adding them is the trick.
Let's do those 5 and then that will be it. How's that?
Okay.
Fair enough.
Some libertarians argue against bans on indoor smoking because they violate private property rights. What is the best rebuttal to that argument?
I would let the property owner decide, but if it is a public building, like a library, or just like Fairfax County Courthouse, I think the government should ban smoking. They're the de facto owner. Smoking's bad for other people. They have the right to ban it. Let's do it.
Okay. What's the biggest economic policy mistake or mistakes made by the left and by the right?
Well, I think the biggest mistakes get made by both sides at the same time. So not really seeing there was a bubble and banking crisis brewing in 2008 was a huge mistake. And most people, myself included, to be clear, were culpable, left and right.
What story in economic history is under-taught to economists?
The history of the rise of the East Asian economies and China. Like, you think it's obvious, most people have never studied it.
Okay, and how will universities evolve over the next 20 years?
I think 1/5 of everything that is done will be online. I think face-to-face is totally robust, has obvious advantages, but imagine you could cut out like the worst 1/5 or 1/4 of what you had, where we all know you learn nothing, and take something online, where you don't have to wake up at 8 a.m., you can study when you want, do the whatever when you want. Like, of course we're gonna do it. So that'll be a big change. It's like 1/5 of the revenue will go other places, and that's gonna happen pretty soon.
Okay, that's it. I think that was 4 instead of 5, but that's okay.
Okay, a pleasure speaking to you all. Thank you all, those who organized it. And yeah, see you all around at Hughes Garden or somewhere, who knows?
Thanks so much, Tyler. It's been a pleasure. We're recording this program, so we'll post something on the every YouTube channel. Even.
Send me the link when you have it. I will put it on Marginal Revolution.
All right. Thanks so
Okay.
much again. Thank
Good
you
night,
all for
everyone.
coming,
Bye.
joining us. Good night. Thank you.